Welcome, everyone. We are here tonight. I'm very excited with an author, Keith Mason, for writing his new book, Please Stand Up. My name is Loretta Depka. I'm the Executive Director at The Starting Point. I love doing these podcasts when we can talk about something new and interesting. And I think this book will touch all of you. Tonight, it's a little different than we normally do. We will still be asking questions, but we will not be talking with a practitioner. Instead, Keith, besides being an author, is a husband, father, son, and as of November, I believe, Keith, a grandfather.
Right.
He lives in our area and is has been a writer in nonprofit communications and public relations for over 35 years. Definitely a history buff. And I say that because I read his book. He did some entertainment reporting, focusing on music. I think it was a very cool gig for a young man. And he's here today because he penned the very personal book, Please Stand Up. He shares an incredible journey in his book, very personal journey. But he discovers not only his biological father, grandfather, and 8 siblings he never knew until he was in his 60s. I promise that the questioning will not ruin the book. We're not going to talk about every little detail, but just some interesting things. And you can follow up by purchasing the book yourself. Please Stand Up can be bought on Amazon and Kindle in ebook format, or purchased as a paperback from your favorite bookstore. So with all of that, did I miss anything, Keith?
I'm 5'11" and a half. I used to grow tomatoes.
There you go. I'm sorry. You didn't tell me that. So
that pretty much wraps it up.
Okay, well, thank you. So Keith, I know that we have this plan of what we're going to talk about, but I just have to share with the audience a couple things that I found so interesting in the book. Did you really read the entire World Book Encyclopedia?
On the fly.
Okay.
When you're in 5th, 6th grade and the teacher gives you an assignment to write something about the moon, and you pull out the encyclopedia. For those kids in the audience, these were a series of books up on your bookshelf that did not really have the word pedia after them, but you knew what it was. You'd open up the book, you'd take out the M, and you'd end up with something, start with Mayfair, and you'd flip page and page and page to get to moon before you started doing your essay. But meanwhile, anything interesting in between, I would read some today and some tomorrow and some the next day. So over the course of 4 or 5 years, I have had to have read the entire encyclopedia, plus the annual update editions that would come in the mail every year.
That was always my favorite read, the annual updates.
So that prepared me for a lifetime of Jeopardy wizardry and a few other things that paid equally unwell.
And I have to ask you about Steve Allen being your idol that you also mentioned in the book, and people will connect it, but why Steve Allen?
I wanted to be Steve. I wanted Steve to adopt me. A chance to sit with him a couple of times to talk and have dinner. Again, for the youngsters in the audience, the originator of The Tonight Show back in the 50s, and the guy from whom everything else spread in that direction. So every late night host who's done a sketch out on the street, who's done Man on the Street, Steve got on a platform playing a Steinway, and the platform rose up over Times Square live on New York City television for The Tonight Show. So anybody who's done a stunt, an interview in the street, and anything, a sketch of some kind, an advertising satire on the late night shows, Steve did it first and was in film, songwriter, authored dozens of books. Most importantly, a quick master of language, not necessarily a joke machine, didn't tell jokes, but he would use what he was saying, what somebody else was saying, the wordplay, the the quick wit with anything that anybody was saying. I was just enamored when I was from the point where I first started knowing who the guy was, and just continued on through the rest of his life. I was his biggest fan because I wanted to be Steve.
Well, okay, I guess
He
we've
was
got it.
taken.
They were just the interesting things that I picked up that were very humorous to me. Okay, Steve, so Keith, having been a writer for most of your life, what was the experience like writing this very personal story? Researching all of it.
Well, I'd never written a book before. I'd always done short form. As you mentioned, I did rock and roll stuff when I was in my 20s, and then chapter by chapter in my work life, turned myself into a professional public relations guy, and then a fundraising guy in the nonprofit sector. Worked at Drexel University, worked at the home of the new home of the Philadelphia Orchestra that was being built, working for disability services, for other kinds of education, spent a lot of time in the arts, things of that nature. So I was always doing the PR in short form. Come to this show, make a donation to this organization, support this other organization, here's why. And it was paragraphs, it was newsletters, it was pitches to the media, all that sort of stuff. I was a short form guy, but a storyteller. And when this thing happened to me in 2016, I was compelled to write about it because to not do so would have been dereliction of duty. Well, I'm a writer. Oh, look at me for the last 4 years. Well, look at this thing and what are you doing with it? Well, I guess I better write about this because that's who I'm supposed to be. And I thought I had it self-contained. Well, I'll spend 2 or 3 months. I'll put together 12 pages. Esquire won't buy it, but somebody will buy it. And that turned into 4 or 5 months and 25 pages, and 6 months and 40 pages, and a year and 63 pages. It just went on and on and on. And at one point I had to say, well, if I'm going to do this, this has got to be a book. I had to teach myself how to write a book, how to structure and edit and do the things that a book writer has to do, which are the same and yet often very different from the guy who's got to put everything that needs to be said into 3 paragraphs, because anything more than that, the guy at the TV station won't read it anymore. So learning to write like that was part of that adventure. The other half was living it at the same time. It wasn't about, oh, I'm going to do this. I'm going to research everything I can about this and put it into a form and give it to people. I was living this day to day to day. And I even got into some situations where I was making some decisions or going through my processes to benefit the writer instead of benefiting the me. And there were times I had to just catch myself, or my wife would make some remark because she saw what was going on. I had to catch and say, well, I could really do this here on the keyboard as a part of my work. But shouldn't I be just sitting here letting this affect me? Shouldn't I just be letting it happen? It's like when you go on vacation and you spend all of your time working the camera through this little pigeonhole here. Shouldn't you just put the camera down and live that sunset or live that vista or live that whatever it is? So I went through a lot of that as well, when the living of it and the writing of it kept banging into each other. But after 4.5 years, I got everything separated out and went through dozens of drafts and all the things that you have to do. And finally, there it is. There's the book.
what I find so interesting, I think, in all honesty, Keith, is that you stumbled on this vintage TV show, and it was only then you started visiting it all, or taking the journey. I don't know quite how to say what was it that made you take that journey?
Well, the essence of it all, and some of the folks who have joined us here in the room are familiar. I never knew my father. I knew just something about him that my mother had given to me when I was 14. Well, you're old enough now, here's a little bit of stuff. And, well, it was kind of adventurous. He had some controversy. He was in a news magazine. Oh, he did that. Okay. But that's all I had. And after I was into my 50s and 60s, even though you may, as I had in my case, walled off emotionally this guy who was only around with my mother for a couple of months, left while I was in utero. And I'd spent, again, these decades just not addressing it. In fact, there are even people, you go out on a date with somebody and by the first or second date, well, my parents do this, my parents do that. Well, I don't know my dad. Oh, so you're going to go out and you're going to investigate now? You're going to go find your father? Well, no, I'm really not that interested in finding out about my father. What are you, crazy? But I had my walls up. But you get into 50s and 60s in your life, you get at some point in your life, the little curiosities bubble up. You've got your own kids, maybe you've got grandchildren coming along, things. You've got a different perspective on life and you start thinking about things. But match that with the emergence of the World Wide Web. Look what you can find on the internet these days. So little episodes would come along when I'd have 15 spare minutes at the computer down in the basement. Okay, I'll put in a couple of keywords that I know and see what pops up. So I put in a couple of keywords about my dad, and yeah, some things would pop up. So I would find a couple more small New England magazine pieces. He was a deep sea salvage diver raiding old sunken German U-boats from the war. So a couple of things would come up, but they petered out after a while. They were becoming repetitive. There was nothing new. And I was just about to say, okay, well, thank you for the web, but I've found enough. That's all I need to know. There's nothing new that's going to come along here. And then in October of 2016, I put in some of the keywords, maybe in a different order, and up pops a result that I'd never seen before. And here we get to one of those moments where I feel like I'm on NPR. As I say in my book, this new thing comes up, and I know what it is, but I don't really. But I know. Look, I'm gonna let me click on this, and up pops the whole screen. It's a YouTube. I know from the text around it. Oh, it's this. It's an episode of the game show To Tell the Truth from 1961. What? Click on the button. Rolls through. It's about people impersonating somebody to try to fool the celebrity panel and win some money. And the first part of the show goes through, and the second part of the show goes through, and the third part of the show. Here are three guys, one of whom is real, and two others are pretending to be an underwater salvage expert. And although it doesn't happen immediately, one of these three guys on a TV show in 1961 is my father. So those old age curiosities lead to more curiosities and lead to those grand investigations that you mentioned at the beginning that brought me to other family, that brought me through American history. It turns out that, as I said, he wasn't a regular guy working in a store. He was a fairly controversial salvage diver who turned out to have a fairly sociopathic checkered history that included 7 marriages to 6 women. That brought me 8 half siblings that I certainly never knew about. And then brought me a grandfather who equally was not a farmer or a salesman. He was a crusading reporter who ended up in a small, dusty, corrupt, politically corrupt town called Alice in Texas, where in 1949 on a radio show that he was doing, he set up a local sheriff. This guy over here, he runs a house of prostitution just outside the city limits. Sheriff did not take to that, so he seeks him out in the streets and kills him right in the middle of the street. In one of the very earliest episodes of a broadcaster murdered to shut him up over freedom of the press. So here I am sitting in this basement in New Jersey, chapter after chapter, episode after episode, unfolding this whole thing. And living it, like I said, and trying to understand it all. The historian in me and the old reporter in me now just diving in without any scuba gear and just coming up with stuff after stuff after stuff after stuff. And as I talk about sculpture sometimes, when you're doing loose clay sculpture, you have a base, you have a pole, and you slap everything onto it, all just a big pile of clay, and then you carve away everything that doesn't look like a horse. And that's how I had to approach this, because I'd never done a book before, I'd never done a memoir, I'd never done a history. I just had all this stuff, and I just tried to shape it into something, which luckily I had enough skill to do it.
And the way you describe the area you grew up, I know that I myself knew exactly where you were talking about. And during that time, it just was so recognizable, I guess I would say, for those that live locally. They'll feel the same way, I'm sure.
We had the benefit of local. You remarked when we had a previous conversation that you saw a lot of what was there that reminded you of when you were young, but that I didn't name the town. And I did that on purpose, because rather than just say, oh, here's the town, and you can look it up on the map if you wanted to, well, it's this. I wanted to just leave that open so that it was just an American middle-class town in the 1950s and the 1960s, and what it was like in the 1920s when my immigrant grandparents first came into that town, and what it was like very briefly for my mom to grow up there, and then for me to grow up there in the same house that she was raised in, just to set the stage for who this New Jersey guy was, so that you can contrast it with all these other people from all these other places. So I enjoyed, again, digging that up out of my own family basket.
Well, it was just fun, because I knew you and I went to the same high school. I will say you went a couple years ahead of me, but.
Sorry, I didn't know you at the time, that I didn't put it inside my yearbook. But.
I know, it's funny. So why don't you give us a little bit on your grandfather? Well, you really did a nice job of talking about your Texas grandfather, the reporter. But what about your grandfather that lived down the street?
Well, I was raised in my grandparents' house, because after my father took off, my mother did the difficult thing. It's the 1950s, it was damn difficult, and it's probably always difficult. I'm going to keep the child. And I grew up in their house for the first 14 years, and was raised by, I had the benefits of having a two-income family until my grandfather retired. Back when I first came along, early 1950s, there were 3 million kids in this country who were paternal orphans, who didn't have a father. Somebody who didn't come back from the Second World War or the Korean War. Somebody who dropped over shoveling the snow. Somebody who get nailed by that diner at the traffic circle over the next town. Somebody who just gets fed up and walks off. I was one of 3 million paternal orphans in the early 1950s in this country. But at least I grew up with an average middle-class household with the incomes from two professionals in the house and a grandmother staying home to take care of the kid so they could go do that. So I had the vacations and I had the Boy Scouts and I had the toys, and I didn't have any brothers or sisters. I was the one only child in a neighborhood of bigger families. But as my mother explained it to me, there are all kinds of families out there made up of all kinds of elements, and this is what you have. Okay, fine with me. My grandmother was the most wonderful woman I've ever had in my life. My grandfather was the father figure. He was the tall male figure when I was little. And he did okay by me in the first 8, 9 years, 10 years, supported me in the Scouts and all that sort of thing. Later, 11, 12, 13, things got very rough around the edges because he retired, and having this little ball of energy running around was not what he signed up for. And it finally came to a head when I was 14 and my mom scrapped together her monies and moved us out to an apartment building across town. So at least I had a stable family unit, and you could have conversations with all sorts of people about, well, wouldn't it have been better if you'd had a father, even if he was that guy who deprived all of his other kids, in many situations deserted other kids. Had good times with him, as I've heard in talking to the new siblings that I discovered. But you know, that guy, being just with my mom, I didn't have. You get in these conversations. Well, would you have been better off? Well, I know people who had the dad and would have been probably perfectly okay if they didn't, because he was a belt swinger, because he was an alcoholic, because he just brought the wrong stuff into the house and into those relationships. I had a more open, cleaner slate. Was I psychologically deprived with the therapist upon hearing, oh, you never knew your father? We're going to have to look into that. Did I carry around a suitcase full of stuff, not having a father? Of course, had to. But did I avoid a lot of stuff in terms of this guy, my father, who I discovered about him and what he was like and what he had done to others of his children? I'm probably better off. You have to ask all the other siblings about that balancing kind of a thing. I've only got my story, and I'm probably okay not having had.
And your mom just seems like she was a very special lady. And you said you shared the book with her and she was pleased, right?
Yeah, she was proud of what I've done. She was amazed that I'd come across the YouTube of the old TV show. The way I just described it, the way I thought about it, this piece of her life, this guy she trusted when she was young, who then did her wrong and left me behind as the deposit. I compare to when I was 16 years old, I got hit by a car out of my bike. Small, slow speed, a couple of stitches on my knee. No big deal. But I can look down today and see just barely. Well, there's that mark. I see there it is, and here's the other one on the other side. It doesn't bother me. Nothing hurt anymore. It's way gone, but it's there. And my mother's experience with my father is probably the same kind of a thing. The hurt is long gone. The stitches are still there. The little mark is still there. And I was very careful when I was growing up not to bring this up. She told me at one point when I was 10, 12, whatever, anything you want to know about your father, you just ask and we can talk about it. Great, thanks, Mom. No questions. I didn't want to bring this to her. I didn't want to know because, number one, I didn't want to force her to have to tug open a stuck drawer in order to provide the answers from her emotional basis to talk to me about stuff. I didn't want to force her to dredge up it. And secondly, my approach to the old man was that I was not going to dignify him with my curiosity. You want to be out, you want to have, but see it, okay, I'm all right. Of course, like I said, I'm carrying around this suitcase of garbage emotionally, but hey, I guess I did okay.
And you turned out pretty well. You're a father yourself, a grandfather now, a successful writer. So,
well, successful than having done the thing. Now let's move on to the next 5 years of my life, of the marketing and the promotion and going into every Barnes and Noble in the country. Hey, working on it. It just dropped in the middle of April. So it's still young and fresh. There's still time.
and it's exciting. You have to be excited to have to do those things. You know, selling a book can be fun. I just wonder how you manage the selling of the book with something so personal. I mean, that's a lot of stuff you're carrying. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, if I don't sell it, you know, I'm not going to have a garage full of 500 boxes of my books laying around. I went through 75 agents in about 8 months, and nothing came of that. So okay, so Simon and Schuster's not doing the book. Done it myself. Happens all the time. There's probably 1,000 books a day that people self-publish that get into Amazon, but I trust my content. I trust my story. I was in a waiting room today, and across the way there, sitting there waiting for somebody, where the woman was reading something, and I thought I recognized the book, and I said, "Hi, I talk about your book. What are you reading there?" And it was a nonfiction, and I asked her, "Are you a nonfiction fan?" "Yes, I'm a nonfiction fan." "Can I tell you about a book?" And she got interested in it, and I pulled this little slip that I keep in my wallet so that I could hand to somebody as I go through my day. And did she go home tonight and look at my website, www.pleasestandupmason.com, and say, "Wow, this looks really interesting. And that guy in the waiting room was really interesting. Amazon, blah, blah, blah." Will that happen? Maybe yes, maybe no. So I've got a couple of years of people in waiting rooms and people in bookstores and all that to do. But yes, is exciting as long as I manage myself. Because when I was doing the book and researching and talking to clerks in old city halls in Waco and Texas, pushing them down to the basement to find an old 3x5 card about something that I needed, or talking to a cop in Louisiana, or talking to a marriage office, the registrar in Ohio, or what have you. Doing all this stuff and hunkering in the basement 5 nights a week, a lot during the day. I left my wife away a lot. And she knew I was in my journey, that this was something that had to be done. I knew at 8 o'clock at night I was going to shut this thing down and go upstairs and watch TV and get back into life again. I'm not going to say it cost her a lot, but she sacrificed. So in this next part of things, when I'm just doing my marketing and my selling and talking to reporters on the phone and trying to juice things up, and I'll put an asterisk on this, which I'll return to do in just a second. I'm now determined I am not going to just be so deep down this rabbit hole with this other part of it, that I do the same things in my home life, in my own self, that I did while I was creating it. So I'm not involved 8 hours a day. I'm not down in the basement every night doing stuff. We have our time, I do some of this, we do some of that. I get out of the chair so my sciatica doesn't act up.
There you go.
But I'm now very careful to be just as emotionally invested in my retired life with my wife and the world around us as much as I am with doing this thing on and on and on again. And getting back to that asterisk that I have when it comes to promoting, getting into the press, trying to get this, trying to get that going on. It's not going to be easy to do because the television industry, especially at a very high level, is very insular, full of gatekeepers. You just can't get somebody on the phone. But if you're out there, if I'm not a guest on the current edition of To Tell the Truth sometime next year, I'm going to be really ticked off.
I don't blame you. You should be the first one they call.
I should be on this the season opener.
There you go.
That's for darn sure.
Well, if you need support letters, we'll just have to get them from Starting Point, right? The Starting Point family will get behind you, right, guys? The one thing that I found interesting when we were talking the other day was you did this through the internet and not genetic testing or genealogy that you can buy all over the place. Is that the advice you would give someone else if they're getting ready to write?
Well, if you're getting ready to write, and if you're getting ready to live, you got to do as much of this thing called everything as you feel solid about, as you feel comfortable about. All I could do is take care of my own scenario. I'm no expert at going after your roots. I'm no genealogist. There are all sorts of interest groups and support groups and publications and subscriptions, and magazines, and there's just a ton of stuff out there to help somebody drill into their past, into their family world. If somebody wants to write about all of that, you can either make whatever you're writing, you can either make it interesting to yourself or you can make it interesting to everybody else at the same time. It took me some lessons. I had to do my reading. I had to do a lot of drafting. I had to work with, for a short period of time, with a support group where people passed around their manuscripts and got feedback. Because I'd had a career in writing, I trusted myself to do a good job in the end, but I still gathered in new skills and a lot of practice along the way. So I'm not giving anybody any special advice about how to become a good writer or how to find out where your family is or what your roots are or who might be missing, that sort of thing. All I can say is there are plenty of tools out there and plenty of people who have been through that kind of thing before. Seek them out, make use of them, gather in as much as you can, because the more you've got to work with, the sooner some dart in the wall is going to stick. But that's about as wise as I can become on that subject.
You said you saw some similarities between your siblings when we talked about your siblings. What's some of the traits that you found that you have and share with them?
After I'd gotten to a point where I discovered that there were more people out there, the first one that was real obvious to me, by obvious I don't mean there he is. At one point it got as obvious as it became to me was, all right, well, I'm looking for a guy named Smith who lives in Ohio. That should be a piece of cake. This was my older brother who was born before me and who had been not taken care of by his dad and pretty much deserted. He ended up as an honored homicide cop in Ohio. And making that contact with him was going to be extremely difficult. because I had to make sure it was exactly the right guy. I was not going to just guess and send an email out to somebody and have a bounce back say, I don't know who you're talking about, but I'm not your long lost brother. I would have killed me if that happened. So I had to be sure. But again, with the magic of the internet and other things, I was able to be sure. But still going in, finally getting to the post office, a 5-page letter, registering it, sending it out. I could have been warmly embraced. It turns out they knew that there was another guy out there somewhere. They didn't know how to find me or him, but they knew I was out there someplace.
That's amazing.
But by going in on this guy, I could have been warmly swept in. I could have had the door slammed on me. Oh, here's Dad's worst mistake, or anything in between. And I wasn't just going to knock on the door and say, surprise, tell the grandchildren who this guy is. I wanted to do this very carefully.
That was very kind of you, by the way, Keith. I found that amazing because
I was
most
being
people
kind to-
just go in like stormtroopers.
I was being kind to me and kind to everybody else. But as it turns out, my older brother, Rod, the cop, felt, and I'm glad I got to him when I did, because he was on that decline from dementia, which eventually took his life about 1.5 years ago. I've lost 2 of my siblings since I started meeting my siblings.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And, but after we had 2 meetings, one of which was a road trip to Ohio, and I took my adult son along as well to meet his uncle. His reaction was that out of all the other siblings that he'd met, because he was an only child too, I was the one most like him.
Cool.
And equally, he was the one most like me. And you can see it in those ways that people talk about, going into the first meeting. Well, will we both order the shrimp at dinner? Will we cross our legs at the same time? Will we do that twinsy kind of stuff? And mostly no, but we do have some telephone movies between the 2 wives and the 2 of us. Well, the first time I met the guy, yeah, we walked together, we sort of talked together, but he wasn't in his full flower because he was beginning his decline. So it was a softer kind of a thing. But at that point, 67 years of having nobody in your life, and all of a sudden I'm walking along the streets of a town in Pennsylvania, and then later sitting around a raucous table of relatives who've turned out to meet me with this guy who's 2 years older than me, who had been a part of my life and had been totally out of my life. To have that happen when you're in your late 60s, have it any time is a thing. To have it happen so far down your road is a thing. But of course, it turned out well, and I was welcomed in, and it did matter to him, and it was special for him that I managed to get to him before, because he knew he was going along, and it was good that I got there before the door closed.
I was so touched by your story about Rod, right? That was Rod. Yeah. Well, I hate to say it, we're out of time, but here you go. This one,
I have this book.
buy his book, and you can get all the other information that you need. You can find it on Amazon and Kindle. You can also find it at your favorite bookstore. See, I can do commercials, right? Anyway, thanks so much for joining us. Please join us for June's podcast, At the Starting Point, which will be a series on the loss of loved ones, split into parents, grandparents, significant others, spouses, and the loss of a child. So we'll be doing 4 during the month of June that I hope you'll join us for. And Keith, I cannot thank you enough. I wish you the best of luck with the book. And you might have to come back for more because we didn't even touch the information in your book. Have a good one.
It's out there. And thanks very much, Loretta. Thank you to everybody who joined us.
All right. See you all soon in June. Have a great night.